The morning fog hasn't even lifted when the bailiff's boot kicks in your splintered door. Before you can grab your shawl, iron fingers clamp your wrists, children scream. A neighbor hisses, witch, you're dragged through the muddy streets, the whispers following like a shroud. By sunset you are strapped to a wooden bench, your feet roasting over red-hot bricks, while to sober-faced men ask very politely, mind you whether you flew to the Sabbath last night. Confess, they say, and the agony ends, confess, and you burn anyway. Imagine that impossible choice, the sheer terror of it. Between 1500 and 1700, chilling scenes like this played out perhaps 100,000 times across Europe. How did ordinary villages, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone, suddenly turn into killing machines? And why did the world, or at least the powerful figures within it, barely blink? It's a story of fear, faith, and a terrifying thirst for control. Picture Europe around 1560. It's not just a rough time. It's a living nightmare for many. The Little Ice Age isn't just a quaint historical footnote. It's a period of devastating climate change, biting cold, and relentless rain that has stolen not one, but two, sometimes even three, harvests in a row. Fields lie fallow or yield only meager scraps. Famine stalks the land, making every winter a gamble for survival. And as if that weren't enough, the Black Death, though past its peak, still echoes in the collective memory, a constant reminder of death's arbitrary nature. On top of it all, Europe is a powder keg of religious strife. Catholics and Protestants aren't just debating theology. They're trading pamphlets, yes, but also cannonballs and musket fire across battlefields that span entire nations. Every hail-stripped field, every sudden illness, every unexplained death feels like the devil's personal graffiti scrawled across their lives. When the milk sours for no clear reason, when a child dies of a mysterious ailment, when lightning splits the church steeple, someone must be to blame. The sheer weight of misfortune demands an explanation, a tangible enemy. And who better than the witch? She's a neighbor you already envy for her small plot of land, or perhaps you gossip about her eccentric ways, already half believing there's something eerie about her. An accusation against her costs nothing for the accuser, but it pays off handsomely: her confiscated cow, her corner plot of land, and most importantly, her silence under torture. Fear, when combined with such potent incentives, economic, social, and psychological, creates the perfect, deadly match. It's a tinderbox, and the smallest spark can ignite an inferno. So, how did this widespread terror become so official? Well, it starts with the highest authority. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issues his papal bull, *Summis Desiderantesse Effectibus*, a document that literally translates to desiring with ardent affection. But what he ardently desired was the persecution of witches. This bull wasn't just a suggestion. It was an explicit authorization, a green light for inquisitors to go get them, empowering them to root out and punish alleged witches and heretics without fear of local interference. It transformed what might have been local superstitions into a matter of official church doctrine and legal action. Just 2 years later, in 1486, two German Dominicans, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published the follow-up, a book that quickly became an infamous bestseller. Malleus Maleficarum, which, chillingly, means the hammer of witches. This wasn't just some obscure theological text. It was part theology rant, part legal handbook, and part utterly misogynistic screed. It insisted, with terrifying conviction, that when a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil, cementing the idea that women, by their very nature, were more prone to witchcraft and more susceptible to the devil's temptations, drawing on the biblical narrative of Eve's original sin. The book detailed how to identify witches, how to extract confessions through torture, and how to conduct trials. It was a step-by-step guide to the destruction of lives. The Malleus Maleficarum sold more copies in its first 3 decades than any other book in Europe, save for the Bible itself. Preachers quoted its damning verses from the pulpit. Judges cited its procedures in their courtrooms, and printers, no doubt, laughed all the way to the bank. For the first time in history, witchcraft wasn't just a local superstition or a whispered fear in the dark. It became organized, bureaucratic, sanctioned by the highest religious authority, and, disturbingly, wildly profitable for those who ran the system. This manual weaponized fear and misogyny, turning it into a systematic blueprint for terror that would spread across the continent. Need a quick checklist for the 1600s? Here's the terrifyingly arbitrary version. Female, probably over 40. Maybe she owns a cat, an obvious familiar. Perhaps she knows a bit too much about herbs, or mutters to herself when she thinks no one's listening. Or maybe, just maybe, she has a wart. That wart, you see, could be the devil's mark. Prick it with a needle, and if it doesn't bleed or show pain, well, there's your proof. Then there's the infamous float test, a true damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. They'd tie you up, right thumb to left big toe, and toss you into the nearest pond. If you sank, you were innocent, though probably drowned. Congratulations, you're dead, but innocent. If you floated, you were guilty, clearly buoyed by the devil's magic. So we burn you either way, what a choice. But the real gold standard for a conviction was spectral evidence. This was truly insidious. A witness, often a young girl, would claim to have been attacked by your spirit in a dream, or to have seen your spectral form tormenting others. And dreams, apparently, don't lie. How do you defend against an accusation from a dream? You can't. Under the intense duress of torture, names would multiply like fleas on a mangy dog. One woman in Bamberg, under unimaginable agony, named 300 accomplices before her tongue literally split. The more you hurt, the more names you gave, and the more the jailers charged your family for your meals, for the chains that bound you, and for the final cordwood that would fuel your pyre at the stake. This wasn't justice, it was a perversion of it, Renaissance style, where the legal system became a tool for extortion and institutionalized murder. Let's zoom in on a particularly grim example. Archbishop Johann von Schnannenberg of Trier, a man obsessed with purity and order in his electorate, faced a crisis. When crops failed year after year, and the region plunged into famine, he didn't blame the Little Ice Age. He blamed Satan's fifth column, the witches among his flock. From 1581 to 1593, a terrifying wave of persecution swept through his lands. Over 12 years, an estimated 368 people were burned at the stake. These weren't just marginalized figures. The victims included respected teachers, mayors, even a former city councillor, demonstrating how the hysteria could consume anyone, regardless of their social standing. Our journey through terror continues a little later, in the Prince-Bishopric of Fulda. Here, we meet Prince Abbot Balthasar von Dernbach, a man who had been exiled by Protestants for decades. Upon his dramatic return, he wasn't just looking to restore order. He was looking to settle scores, all under the convenient cover of piety and rooting out evil. His right-hand man, a particularly brutal and suffocatingly named individual called Balthasarus, perfected the art of the show trial. These weren't about finding truth, they were about securing confessions, no matter the cost. Nuss employed a horrific array of torture devices, thumbscrews that crushed bones, the strappado which dislocated shoulders, and the dreaded boot, a device designed to shatter legs and feet. These brutal methods crushed the wills of some 250 victims in just 3 years, with a staggering 80% of them being women. The abbot's treasury swelled with the confiscated farms and possessions of the accused, creating a perverse economic engine for the persecutions. His witch hunters weren't just doing God's work. They were earning 8 soldi per head, plus perks and bonuses for every successful conviction. This was a system designed for profit, not justice. When the Prince Abbot himself died unexpectedly, Perhaps a divine intervention for some, the jail doors creaked open. Survivors, those few who hadn't been executed, staggered home, missing fingernails, limbs twisted, and often, without any heirs left to greet them. The scars, both physical and psychological, would last a lifetime. Just a few decades later, and in the same region of Germany, the horror intensifies. Now, add the escalating chaos of the 30 Years' War to the mix, starving mercenary armies ravaging the countryside, waves of plague wiping out entire villages, and the new bishop, Philipp Adolf von Arenberg, who at just 19 years old, believed he was God's personal exterminator. He was young, fanatical, and utterly ruthless. Under his reign, Wurzburg became a crucible of terror. 75 to 80% of accused witches across Europe were female. Why this overwhelming gender disparity? The answer lies deep in the intertwined biases of theology, medicine, and law of the era. All agreed, women were considered moist, physically and morally weaker, and therefore Satan's preferred portal to corrupt humanity. This wasn't just casual sexism, it was doctrine. The theological narrative of Eve's original sin positioned women as inherently more susceptible to temptation and more capable of evil. Social roles also played a huge part. Midwives, who possessed intimate knowledge of birth and death, often found themselves competing with emerging male barber surgeons. Herbalists, with their traditional remedies, undercut the expensive apothecaries. Older women, especially those without husbands or male protectors, violated the era's ideal of dependency. They were often independent, sometimes outspoken, and therefore viewed with suspicion. An accusation could conveniently erase them and their perceived economic or social threat in one devastating stroke. How did these terrifying beliefs spread so widely and become so deeply ingrained? A huge part of it was the burgeoning print culture. This was the era of mass media, albeit a primitive one. Broadsheets and pamphlets, cheaply printed and widely circulated, became powerful tools for propaganda. They showed witches riding spits, kissing goat rears, or sailing in sieves across stormy seas. Each grotesque image, often accompanied by lurid descriptions, cemented the fantasy of the witch in minds of people who had never even seen a courtroom, let alone a witch trial. Cheap woodcuts meant that even peasants, who might not be able to read, could paste images of the devil and his supposed minions on their own walls, reinforcing the fear and the visual rhetoric. Meanwhile, from every pulpit, sermons thundered, quoting Exodus, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." This wasn't just religious advice. It was a divine command, a biblical justification for a murder. Try arguing with both the authority of the state and the Almighty in one breath. It was an impossible task. The combination of vivid, terrifying imagery and undeniable religious decree created a powerful, self-reinforcing narrative that made challenging the witch hunts almost unthinkable for ordinary people. But eventually, even the most deeply entrenched madness begins to crack. By 1650, fissures started to appear in the monolithic belief system. Jurists, those who actually had to preside over these trials, began to notice something unsettling. Torture, while effective at extracting confessions, was also remarkably effective at extracting ***. People would confess to anything, name anyone, just to make the agony stop. How could such confessions be reliable? The tide began to turn in various regions. The Dutch Republic, a more progressive and commercially minded state, effectively banned witch trials as early as 1610, realizing the economic and social damage they caused. France's centralized crown began to curtail them in 1624, seeking to assert royal authority over local courts and limit the chaos. Physicians, increasingly relying on empirical observation, began diagnosing mental illness or natural causes for strange behaviors, rather than immediately attributing them to demonic possession. The Enlightenment, still a whisper at first, began to question everything. Maybe, just maybe, the weather had natural causes, and not every misfortune was the devil's doing. In a pivotal moment in 1682, a London jury actually laughed a teenage girl out of court when she presented spectral evidence. The absurdity of it was finally becoming apparent. The last official English hanging for witchcraft occurred in 1685. In Germany, where the hunts had been most brutal, law faculties began to demand better evidence, more rigorous legal procedures, and a higher standard of proof than just a forced confession or spectral accusation. The final European execution for witchcraft, a grim punctuation mark on this horrific era, was Anna Gaudy in Switzerland in 1782. It was far too late for her, a tragic injustice, but her death served as a signal that Europe had, at long last, begun to outgrow its pyromania, shaking off the dark obsession that had claimed so many innocent lives. The European witch hunts were never really about spells or pacts with the devil. They were about power, the power of the church, the power of the state, and the power of fear. They were about panic, the panic of failing crops, religious wars, and inexplicable diseases. And they were about profit, the profit from confiscated lands and the fees for trials and executions. It was a lethal trifecta of climate disaster, intense religious war, and widespread print propaganda that turned neighbor against neighbor, community against itself. And the bodies burned, not because of magic, but so that citizens could believe someone, anyone, was in control amidst the chaos. The next time headlines howl for a scapegoat, the next time a crisis leads to the demonization of an easy target, remember the smoldering stakes of Bamberg and Trier. Remember the systematic oppression, the weaponized misogyny, and the sheer human cost. Fear sells, but history buys it with blood, and the receipt is 100,000 names long, predominantly women whose only crime was existing in a world that sought to control and diminish them. If you learned something unsettling today, something that makes you look at history, and perhaps even the present, a little differently, please hit share so algorithms don't bury this vital story. Comment with the name of a persecuted woman you'd like remembered, or a historical figure who fought against this darkness. And if you want more deep dives into the grim, yet endlessly insightful corners of our past, tap subscribe. Stay curious, stay kind, and may your neighbors never knock at midnight.